it says it's running. Let me just quickly check that it is on Substack. Let me just website. Okay. Just checking one thing here. Right, I think we're not far off there. Oh, yep, it's running. Great. Okay. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Well, kia ora koutou katoa, and welcome in everyone to a special Hoon, I'd call it, about the reality of everything and health. This is something different for subscribers to the Kaka, but I'm very lucky today to have 4 special guests to talk about the future of everything, the reality of everything, and in particular, how some of the crises, the collection of crises that are hitting the globe are affecting health. Health is the topic today. We'll talk about others in future weeks, but today it's all about health. And firstly, I'd like to introduce Catherine Knight, who is a Substacker as well, and has been writing about climate and we've interviewed before on the Kaka. Catherine Knight, could you tell us a bit about the Reality of Everything event and what it's about first?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me and the others along today, Bernard. It's great to be here. So, the Reality of Everything Symposium is planned for the 26th of June this year. And it's really designed to lay out the interconnected realities of the global situation, which includes, of course, climate change, the border poly crisis, the economy and trade, energy supply, food security, and public health, of course, which we'll be talking about today, and especially as these dynamics and trajectories affect New Zealand. And the whole idea, really, of the Reality of Everything Symposium is to um, perhaps not influence government politicians directly, although they are certainly invited to the symposium. Instead, the emphasis is on building awareness of this reality in civil society, and it's hoped that will in turn create this, build this critical mass of reality conscious people, which will in turn influence policy making.
Fantastic. So that's an event, and we'll put the details of that event coming up in the show notes. For regular viewers of the Kaka and the Hoon, you will of course recognise Catherine Dyer, who is a lecturer in climate change at Victoria University and one of the regular co-hosts on the Kaka. Catherine, lovely to see you, and you're helping and involved also in this conference, is that correct?
Yeah, great to see you too, Bernard. Yeah, I'm involved with Catherine in the organisation end of the conference, and at the conference itself, I'm going to be working with Dr. Anne Bardsley from the Complex Conversations Lab at the University of Auckland, looking at deliberative democracy methodologies that we can use to help to carry that, keep the conversation going beyond the conference and to hopefully influence policy in the future.
Fantastic. So I was looking forward, it was looking to be a great conference coming up. But one thing I was keen to do was to try to understand a bit of the thinking behind why the conference might be useful and look at a really interesting precedent that was set last year in the United Kingdom, which was a national emergency briefing. It was a really interesting collection of addresses by experts in their fields, looking at the various elements of the, particularly the climate crisis, but how it was affecting many things. And one of those things was health. And so what I thought we'd like to do today is examine the key speaker on health and then talk to some experts here in Aotearoa who are focused closely on this issue of the climate crisis and the emergencies and risks and planning perhaps we should be doing around health. And I'm very lucky today we have a couple of academics who are experts in their fields. Firstly, we've got Professor Alistair Woodward from the University of Auckland, who's an epidemiologist and public health medicine specialist. Alistair, lovely to see you.
Thank you, Bernard. I'm pleased to be here and I'm looking forward to contributing to the meeting.
And we're also very lucky to have Carolyn Shaw with us, Associate Professor Carolyn Shaw from the University of Otago, who is also an epidemiologist and a public health medicine specialist, focusing on transport in particular. But lovely to see you, Carolyn.
Bernard, nice to be here.
Thank you. Now, I mentioned before that we had wanted to focus on an event or a speech given at the National Emergency Briefing in the UK, and that speech was one done last year by, let me just grab my notes here so I get this correct. Here, won't be a second.
Hugh Montgomery.
Hugh Montgomery, so it won't be a second. I'm just navigating, and this will be something that I cut out in the edited version, so all of those viewers will see that. That's okay. So one of those speeches was from Professor Hugh Montgomery, who is the Professor of Intensive Care Medicine and a Director of the Centre for Human Health at University College London. And he talked about his role in the NHS and his work in climate change. Carolyn, I wanted to ask you first, having seen that speech or the transcript of the speech, what is the key risk, do you think, or the thing we should focus on around climate change and health?
That feels like a really curly question to start with, Bernard. I mean, I think the point of the impacts of climate change on health is that they cross just about every aspect of health that you could possibly think of. Both kind of infectious diseases, chronic diseases, mental health, all of that kind of stuff. And I think if we're going to talk about a key risk, the risk is that all of them will get worse under a changed climate, basically. And that we need to prepare the health system to respond to that, as well as think about actually how we're going to adapt to it.
Yeah, because public health specialists, have talked a long time about these broad, long-running health issues that affect humans. Smoking is the one that obviously is the most familiar to us. We've done all sorts of interventions over the years, and it had an effect. And that was one that Hugh Montgomery mentioned as one of those things that perhaps you could use as a precedent, a public health issue where you've taken a, concerted, all of system approach to try to bring down a very immediate, albeit one that has been, it covers something we've all been doing all the time for a long time.
Still talking to me?
Yes, Carolyn.
Yeah. I mean, I think tobacco control is a really great example of a series of policies that have been put in place over time that have tackled sort of both people who smoke and prevented people from smoking in the first place. It's focused on making sure that the industry is not normalised. So there's been this really kind of comprehensive series of actions put in place. And it has been, despite the recent sort of reverses, it's been incredibly successful. So it's certainly a model that we could look at, and you need a whole system approach if you're going to start thinking about how it is that you tackle the health impacts of climate change.
And Alistair, if you were looking at a whole system approach, what sort of things would we be doing to protect our health and at least respond to what's happening with climate change?
Well, just to carry on with the tobacco comparison, it does strike me that it was a joint effort with tobacco. And so that meant that we drew on people like Hugh, who were clinicians and who knew very much what the damage to individuals looked like, and the misery and avoidable loss of good life that resulted, and public health people who had a sense of the bigger picture. I think we also combined local efforts here in New Zealand and in Australia with international action. And the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control was an example of an international treaty, that was vital really to get at the root cause of the problem. And then the third thing that I would draw from tobacco that Caroline's already touched on is the importance of thinking about the commercial determinants. And it was clear that we weren't going to make progress on tobacco until we were able to illuminate and curb the influence of the industry. And we did that. It wasn't easy, but it happened. So I would think of those as three things that apply, in my mind anyway, equally to climate change.
Catherine, tobacco is an interesting precedent, if you like, for an entire industry that had a playbook for how to fight back against regulation, and that was eventually adopted by the fossil fuel industry. Is that something we have to think about in a sort of strategic sense? If we're going to address these environmental issues like climate change, you have to think too about who are the guys on the other side.
Me?
Yes, please,
Sorry, which Catherine?
Catherine without an E.
And we do see already with climate change the pushback from the not just the fossil fuel industry, but also from people who want to maintain an economic status quo, which covers a lot of people beyond just the fossil fuel industry. One of the things that I would think is going to be interesting going forward is our ability to maintain the public healthcare system. And I think that was something that Hugh Montgomery referred to as well. And that if you were going to have a plan to address, the impacts on health of climate change, then you actually also have to have a plan to keep funding the public healthcare system. And of course, some of those things, if you address them, make it cheaper to address further problems down the line. But that there's a kind of a circle of virtue, I guess, in addressing some of those issues. But yeah, it does require that you have a political commitment to keeping a healthy public health system going, and we see that being deteriorating already in Aotearoa at the moment.
Yeah, Catherine with an E. One of the issues around health and who is affected most by climate change is often driven by the social connections, the underlying health of a particular population, the ability to access medical care, or just how wealthy people are, whether or not they can adjust to a hit. One of the comments that Hugh made, I think that really struck me was that there are social determinants of health that aren't just, bolted on. How does that apply in a New Zealand example? Because we've seen that it looks like those people who are least able to afford, damage from climate are also the ones who are most likely to be hit by it.
Absolutely. And I think this is true of all climate change impacts, isn't it? That those most socially vulnerable are going to be the ones that are hit hardest and are less able to remove themselves from that risk and danger. I mean, we see that across the board, including, for example, insurance retreat, or the ability to manage risk around homes and property, etc. And that will certainly, I imagine, apply also to health. I mean, it already applies to health even under the status quo, where you imagine a situation where climate change doesn't apply. It already applies. So there would be no reason to believe it wouldn't apply with the climate change impacts layered on. Which going back to Catherine's point, makes it all the more critical that we don't just siphon off the need for good healthcare and say, well, let's just leave it to the market, as we have done for so many things in our highly neoliberal economic system, and that we're seeing some very concerning dynamics towards at the moment. All the more reason that we need to, as Catherine says, keep our public healthcare system strong and robust and able to meet these needs, which, under current conditions, it's already, as Hugh Montgomery alluded to in the UK, that they're under the same kind of strain as we are facing right now here in Aotearoa. Very, very similar situation, and he is warning of this added strain that is going to compound on the existing one as climate change affects bed in. So it's so critically important that we plan for this and resource ourselves and ensure that we have, the necessary resources, skills, and funding that is necessary. And as Catherine said, it's there's a term for it, failure demand, that basically if we don't invest properly now, we end up paying the cost many, many times over further downstream. And I think this is going to be one key message actually that comes out of the symposium, that there is this, it's a false economy to not invest in these essential public goods, because we are only going to pay the price many, many times over, financially, fiscally, in terms of the human and social costs, many times over downstream.
Yeah, I wanted to bring Caroline back into the conversation around transport, because one of the comments that Hugh made that I found fascinating was when he said that humans aren't wired to manage indeterminate medium-term risk from activities they currently find pleasurable. So he was talking there about the use of cigarettes, drugs, unprotected sex, alcohol, all of those sort of things. But you could also talk about things like transport, and I was going to say we all love to jump in a fast car and push down the accelerator, but I'm not sure everyone does. But there's certainly a chunk of the population who like the freedom of driving a big car or a double cab ute, perhaps, and to have a network of roads which they personally can use for free. And the idea of sitting in a bus or a train doesn't seem quite so exciting as sitting in a nice leather seat of a fancy car. But can you tell us about some of the transport implications for health, which may not be sort of obvious to everyone, but are in this sort of medium-term risk thing that's quite a lot like tobacco?
There was a lot in that, Bernard. I think the thing with thinking about transport and climate change is that you can frame it as that the transport system is causing climate change, which it absolutely, undoubtedly is. and the transport system is causing really significant amounts of health harm right now as it's currently configured. Or we can flip it around and say, okay, if we had a better transport system, a low carbon transport system, one that kind of focused on making sure that the spaces and the places in our cities supported healthy and low carbon transport, actually we'd be healthier and happier in the quite short to medium term. So the things that we think we're getting out of leather seats and cars and big motorways, actually, there's a whole bunch of other things that people value as well, like personal connection with their neighbours and their friends and their family, and time spent, time available to spend time with their friends and family that currently people might spend sitting in their cars. And so we can rethink about our transport system as climate action and as health action as well, and also probably a whole bunch of other stuff as well, depending on the kind of emphasis that we put on it. And I think that's, in some ways, that's a much more useful way to talk about it than talking about an emergency. Because if you talk about an emergency, people tend to get quite freaked out and paralysed, as opposed to bringing it back to, well, what's an important thing in people's lives that we know about, and how can we improve that? And that's connection, it's their mental and physical health, all of those sorts of things that people mostly really value.
On that transport issue, Alistair, I see that you've done quite a bit of work on the effects of street changes on health and safety, and also the future of the bicycle. Could you talk a bit about how our current policies seem set up for motorways, and there's planning for close to $70 billion worth of roads of national significance in the next couple of decades, but there's been massive cutbacks on spending for cycling, and quite a few political stoushes around things like cycle lanes, reconfiguring streets to be friendlier to pedestrians, these sorts of things. Could you talk a bit about the health aspects around how we design and fund our transport system?
Well, thank you. I think, the roads of national significance are just a great example of how we can go awfully wrong. And my own feeling is that they won't happen. They're just too expensive, But it's interesting, isn't it, that they're sort of a clear indication of how we can get off on the wrong foot with transport. I think what really matters is thinking about why we need transport. The cars with the leather seats are not an end in their own right. They're a means for people to move, to get around, to get access. And I think it's the access question that's the important one. People need access to employment. They need access to friends and social connections. They need access to recreation, all those things. And if we flipped transport on its head and think, so it's not about roads, actually, because roads are just a means to an end. What are we trying to achieve? We're trying to provide people with access to the things that they need for a good life. Then things like the importance of footpaths becomes apparent, because, that's essentially how everybody gets around at some stage during their day. And it's peculiar, it's perverse that footpaths are not included in the transport arrangements. They're not considered part of roads. They don't have a routine for repair and maintenance as, cars transport do. Simeon Brown has got a fetish about footpaths. He strips them out. He won't allow them in new initiatives. They're regarded as the icing on the cake, when in fact they're very much the cake themselves. So my sense is that if we're going to get transport right, we really need to flip it around and think about needs rather than about technology.
Yeah, Caroline, just on this issue of health and transport, I've always been surprised by just how much health damage is done through the particulates that get produced in our current transport system, from diesel, from petrol, from all of that tyre dust that gets thrown up. This is on top of, the car accidents and the car on pedestrian accidents and the car on cyclist accidents. That sort of long-term almost hidden health effects of the way our transport system runs is actually pretty large according to some of the measures. But could you talk a bit more about particulates and respiratory health?
Sure. I mean, you've already sort of covered the main points in some ways, Bernard, is that they are really toxic for health, and they cause a really wide range of health outcomes as well. So it's not just respiratory conditions, but we know that particulates can increase the risk of diabetes. They can be associated with premature birth. I think there's some work now around dementia as well in older age. So there's a very wide range of health outcomes adverse health outcomes they influence. And the other thing is that there's no safe lower limit. So yes, we have limits set by WHO that we're not meant to breach, but actually from a health point of view, there is no safe exposure to these things. I think the other thing to think about in climate change is that these things interact. So we've got our kind of the particulates that are being put out into the atmosphere now, many of which, a proportion of which is from cars, others from things like wood fires and things like that. But under a changed climate, when we've got things like heat going on as well, there's interactions between air pollution and heat that make some of these conditions worse. There's creation of secondary pollutants as well, secondary air pollutants. So it's not, the things that we observe now, many of them will actually be amplified or other kind of related cascading impacts, adverse health impacts will occur under a changed climate.
Yeah, and I see you've just done some research on e-bikes, because I'm always curious about how arguments can be flipped on their heads. One of the arguments used by those who oppose climate change action is that, it's always too expensive to do the green thing. But you can take another view on it, which is, it's cheaper to do the green thing, but also healthier. Can you talk a bit more about that e-bike research that's just come out?
Sure, that was a pilot study that I was involved in the research component of, where we provided no-cost loans to whānau, Pacific and Māori whānau and Wainuiomata. Almost all of whom did not cycle, many of whom had not cycled for decades. And then we followed them up and interviewed them over the course of 12 months. And it was by and large really successful. So in a community where there were no e-bikes, people didn't know anyone with an e-bike, they had not tried them themselves, people took up e-biking and they really enjoyed it, and they used the e-bikes for recreation. They also used them increasingly for transport over time. They reported heaps of health benefits, lots of mental health benefits. And they also talked about sort of wider whānau effects. So one of our participants said that something like 10 people in his wider whānau had taken up cycling as a result of this intervention, because they had seen him and his partner who had access to the e-bikes, and they had all thought, what a great thing, we can do this, and they also took it up.
Just finally, Alistair, what sort of solutions are out there if we wanted to really address some of these health risks with climate change? You've been looking closely at the transport area, but what sort of things would you suggest to policymakers if they suddenly said, you know what, actually we want to reduce our massive liability in our health system because of climate change, and we can see that a healthier population is also a more productive and cohesive one. So what would you say to them?
Well, I think I would pick up the point that Catherine Knight made, that I think it was you, Catherine, that climate change really acts by sort of disturbing the foundations of a good life and good health. It was a metaphor that the Royal Society of New Zealand used when they published a report on climate change and health about 5 years ago. So I think I would say there are opportunities for win-win interventions on climate almost everywhere. We've talked a lot about transport, about the multiple benefits of promoting active transport, getting people walking and cycling and scooting rather than being dependent on cars. We know it's also true in the energy space. If we reduce the amount of fossil fuel we burn, then there's less pollution. It's true in the food area, the options of low carbon diets that are good for health are endless, and quite appetizing. So I think the idea that climate action is all hair shirt and very expensive are just so far from the truth that it's important we do point out that it's not costly, it's cost saving in many ways, and it is not dull and dreary and fun killing. In fact, it's the opposite in many instances, certainly in the transport area. And I think it's also important to point out that, sort of at a macro scale, that climate action and economic growth are not incompatible. If you look at what's happened in the UK, since 1990, the UK has reduced its greenhouse emissions by, I don't know, close to 50%, 60%. And during that time, its GDP went up 2.5-fold, 2.5 times. And that's true in other countries in Europe as well. No reason why it should be any different in New Zealand. So I think if we make good choices, we can make a serious dent in emissions, and also improve our resilience and save money and improve health. So I'm optimistic about the potential. It's just a question of making that real.
Yeah. Caroline, if you got in front of, Simeon Brown, who's also now the Minister of Health, as well as the former Minister of Transport, and the Cabinet, and said, you know what, if you do these things, you're going to save your money, voters are going to be better off, healthier, the economy's going to be better off, even whatever measure you use. What would you say to them?
I guess I would say that I don't know if this audience would necessarily appreciate it, but I guess I would say I don't think there's ever been a time where public health has been more important than it is now. Like, public health action is climate action these days, but also we're facing a changed climate, even if we reduce emissions. So we need to do everything we can now to make sure that our population is as healthy as it can be, because there's a massive question of fairness. There's already unfairness in our society and who benefits and who has the best health and the longest life expectancy. Climate change will make that worse, and we want to get in there and stop that. And we can do that in ways that improve people's well-being, makes them healthier, makes them happier. I mean, it just really doesn't seem like a difficult decision in a lot of ways.
Catherine Dyer, what would you say to Chris Bishop and Simeon Brown if you've got them in the room together as transport and health ministers?
I would just say that from a macroeconomic perspective, a lot of policy choices are made using cost-benefit analysis, which I don't necessarily agree with that as being the predominant way to make policy choices. But if you look at the social cost of carbon globally, the numbers that we're starting to see come out of studies are, northwards of $1,000 per ton of carbon. And when you put those kinds of costs from emitting carbon into the atmosphere and you apply it against the kind of outcomes that you get in terms of healthcare, it really that can really change the calculus as to what is worth spending money on. And we really need to get quite serious about putting a serious cost on that, to understanding the numbers a bit better, in order to have better decision making about where we invest as a society.
Yes, I suspect the Roads of National Significance business case would take on a different hue with a social cost of carbon that was, somewhere north of $30 or whatever it is, the current cost on our emissions trading scheme. Catherine Knight, just finally, ahead of the Reality of Everything conference, what are the sort of solutions, things that might be talked about at the conference around this issue of health?
Around health specifically, well, I mean, we will hear. Alistair will be speaking on that, but probably something that I would say in terms of your question, Bernard, to everyone, and probably taking it up a level, I would completely agree with what everyone said about what we need to act on, and reiterate the point that Carolyn made, that in fact everyone made, I think Alistair made it as well, that when you act on climate change, you're also highly likely going to be making people's lives better. And that's the thing we've got to remember. There's an immediate benefit. And so I guess my overarching comment would be that we must shift away from, a growth-oriented economy where we are determined to deliver on growth, no matter whether or not it's of any value to people, and no matter its cost to our health or to the environment, and shift instead to a wellbeing centered economy that focuses on investment that will deliver on human well-being, and and takes into account planetary boundaries and the effects on climate, etc. Because at the end of the day, if we don't do that, we are completely undermining the basis on which supports us as human beings. So I think it would be just that focus on a wellbeing centered economy that we really need to be thinking about, and all that contributes to that.
Great. Catherine Knight, Catherine Dyer, Alistair Woodward and Caroline Shaw, thank you so much for coming on to a special Hoon here to look ahead to the Reality of Everything conference, and looking at it through the lens of health, and particularly public health. Wonderful to have your time today, and thank you very much. Ka kite anō.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Aotearoa.
I'm just stopping here. I hope I'm stopping. Let me just quickly. So you could all hear me, that's good. Right, I'm just going to refresh my screen so I can stop the recording.
Oops. He's refreshed himself out of the conversation. So I'm going to just say, before everybody disappears, your individual recordings are uploading to the Riverside thing at the moment. So even if you leave the conversation, don't shut down your browser. You need to leave it open until that. You'll see there's a percentage mark up at the top. That's mine says 99% at the moment. So I know that my recording hasn't completely uploaded yet.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And we've got Alistair. Oh, he went from 0 to 99% in about a tenth of a second, which is very, very fast. Yeah, we're almost there. So that's excellent. Hey, thank you very much for coming on. I really enjoyed the chat, and I'm really glad we got a chance to hear from everyone. And once this is recorded, I will do some quick editing to cut out my embarrassing lapses, because you are all very smooth and very good, and we'll cut it down to about 30 minutes and we'll pop it out. And what I'll do is include Catherine and Catherine as authors in the piece that goes out on the kaka, and Catherine, on your website, you're also very welcome to resend it to your subscribers. I will get a WeTransfer zip version of the video, which I can send to you, which you're welcome to use. This will also go up on YouTube and LinkedIn, and I'll be promoting it on those as well, and tagging in your handles, so to speak. And that will mean it gets a wider audience than just this initial one. So, hey, thank you so much for making the time. It went really well, I think. And I'm just going to quickly check to make sure we're all uploaded.
It's still recording, Bernard, so it's going to be actively uploading because it's still recording.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So I've stopped it at my end.
Yeah,
So everyone else is still being recorded. Refresh to try resolving the issue. There we go. Let's see if I can.
He's just removed himself again.
We have when we're recording the Hoon, we have a producer who's Simon, who's sitting in the background doing all the dials. Yeah.